Welcome to Devon and Cornwall Microsoft Power BI user group. Today we have Chris Webb joining us, who will be showing us why we should be interested in Fabric as a Power BI user and the so what for what we can actually get out of it. Sessions coming up are, as you can see, we've got geospatial analysis, then some Power Automate, Power BI and Power Apps, followed by Tablet Editor 3, Warp Speed ahead, error catching in Power BI and Excel, followed by some data storytelling and much more to come. In the meantime, let me hand over to Chris, who will take you through Fabric for the Power BI user.
Cool, thank you. Excellent. Well, let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Chris. I work at Microsoft on the Fabric Customer Advisory team. Used to be the Power BI Customer Advisory team. Now it's the Fabric Customer Advisory team. And that change is significant for what we're going to be talking about today, which is Fabric for the Power BI user. Now, I think at this stage, everybody will have had 1,000 different kind of introduction to Fabric presentations. I want to do things slightly differently. So let me share my screen and start the presentation. Hopefully you can see my screen. Give me a thumbs up, Sue, if you can see the screen.
Yep,
good. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about various different features of Fabric. But, like I said, by this stage, everybody will have heard that Fabric is amazing and cool and new. The real question that I want to address in this session is, so what? Who cares? Now, I am the kind of person who, even before I joined Microsoft, when Microsoft came up with something new, I was just naturally interested. I want to go and try it and play around with it. But that's not everybody. And now I work at Microsoft. I've got to think, how am I going to sell this? How am I going to kind of really pique people's interest? And a lot of the time when people talk about Fabric or any new thing, they talk about the thing. They don't actually say why you should use it or what the point of it is. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about why you, as a Power BI user, should care about Fabric, because you don't need to. You can carry on using Power BI in exactly the same way that you did before, not turn on Fabric, and your life will continue getting better. There will still be lots of new things happening in Power BI. So why should you flick that switch to enable Fabric? Why should you care about Fabric? How is it going to make your life better? All right, now to start answering that question, we have to answer the fundamental question of what is Fabric? And again, I want to address the question from the point of view of the Power BI user, because there are a number of different ways of attacking this question and explaining it. And the way I always like to talk about it is to make this comparison. If you're thinking about Power BI and Fabric, Power BI is to Fabric as Excel is to Office. What used to be called Office is now called Microsoft 365, because of course we mess around with the names, but you know what I mean. Power BI is to Fabric as Excel is to Office. It's now a component of something bigger. Back in the dim and distant past, if you're old enough, I'm old enough, I can remember when Office wasn't a thing. You bought Excel, you bought Word. You need a word processor, you buy Word. You need a spreadsheet, you buy Excel. And sometime, quite a long time ago, somebody brilliant, genuinely brilliant at Microsoft realized that basically spreadsheets and word processors and PowerPoint and things, they're all used by the same kind of people. They're all used by information workers. So rather than everybody buying a different word processor or a different spreadsheet or whatever, why not just package it all up together? You buy one thing and you get a big discount. So we got into the habit of buying Office to get Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all of those things. And guess what? It was a brilliant strategy because, we all want to buy the bundle. And, who cares about Lotus 123 or WordPerfect or any of those other things anymore?
Oh, I remember that.
So, what have we done here? Well, we've kind of made the same had the same idea, because you do Power BI because you want to build reports and you want to build semantic models, but you and the other people you work with, you don't just need Power BI for doing your BI. You need a data warehouse, a database. You might want to do some Spark. You might want to do some streaming with some real-time data. You might want to write some Python. You want notebooks. You don't want to buy lots of different things for that and have to pay for them separately and license them separately and have them all kind of slightly disjointed and not really working together. You want that office experience. You want all of these different tools, but packaged in one thing, and all working together, and all with the same UI. Because with Office, you open up Excel, you open up Word, you open up PowerPoint. They all kind of look the same as well. They've all got the same UI. They've all got VBA. They've all got a ribbon at the top. You learn how to use one, and you can learn how to use the others. So this is what's happened with Fabric. Power BI has been consumed by something wider, which is Fabric. And instead of just selling you Power BI, we want to sell you everything you need for your analytics and reporting, everything your team needs for analytics and reporting. So Power BI, the Power BI service has turned into Fabric. Power BI is just one component among lots of other different components inside Fabric. Some of them genuinely new, some of them, kind of variations on a theme. So what I'm going to do next, and what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation, is go through all of the new stuff in Fabric that you as a Power BI person will care about, which will give you a slight improvement on what you do today in Power BI, or maybe a completely different way of attacking what you do today in Power BI. And let's start at the beginning, and let's start with loading your data, because that's where all business intelligence or reporting begins. You've got to get your data from somewhere. You've got to load it in. All right, so what are the new things in Fabric for data loading? Data Flows Gen 2 is the place to start. And it's a nice, easy thing to talk about because we know about data flows. We're Power BI people. We probably use data flows already. The data flows that you've been using so far in Power BI are what we will now refer to as Gen 1 data flows. In Fabric, when you turn Fabric on, you get Gen 2 data flows as a separate thing. And when you look at a Gen 2 data flow and you create it, you will think, this looks just like a regular data flow. I don't understand the difference. But there are a couple of really, really important differences. First of all, and most importantly, Gen 1 data flows are actually two things rolled into one. They're a self-service data transformation tool. They are also a place to store the data that is output from that data flow, because you open up Power BI, you can open up Excel, and you can connect to a data flow. But when you connect to a data flow, you're not connecting to the data flow itself, you're connecting to the data that was output by the data flow. So with the Gen 1 data flow, you've got the data flow transformation tool, the Power Query online experience, and you've got the place that the data flow stores the data it outputs. The fundamental change with Dataflow Gen 2 is that Dataflow Gen 2 are just the data transformation tool. They are not a place to store data anymore. Now, that sounds like a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, because with Dataflows Gen 2, you've actually got the ability to load data to various destinations. You can load data to Azure SQL DB. You can load data to a lakehouse, to a warehouse, to Azure Data Explorer, lots of different destinations. So by decoupling the data transformation tool from the storage, we've actually given you a little bit more flexibility. Now, what's a lakehouse? What's a warehouse? We'll come to those things in a moment. Another fairly interesting change with Dataflows Gen 2 is that we've re-architected them to make them a lot more scalable. With Gen 1 data flows, if you were just using them by default out of the box, You can connect to lots and lots of different data sources and do transformations. And if query folding works, then you'll get some good performance. If query folding doesn't work, you can get some quite bad performance sometimes. And if you work with very large volumes of data and you can't do query folding, sometimes you can have some big problems. With Gen 2 data flows, what we've done is taken something that was there in Gen 1 data flows and improved it even more. In Gen 1 data flows, if you had Premium and you had the enhanced compute engine, then you could effectively load data in and it would store data in a kind of hidden database behind the scenes. And then when you did more transformations on that data you loaded in, the transformations would get folded back to this hidden database, which meant that everything was a lot more scalable. But this hidden database behind the scenes, what was it? Well, it was kind of like Azure SQL DB, but with some limitations. What's happened with Gen 2 data flows is that we have replaced the old enhanced compute engine with Fabric's data warehouse engine. So Fabric includes a relational data warehouse engine, which is basically the kind of successor to Synapse dedicated pools. It is a super fast, super easy to use, very scalable warehouse engine. And now with Dataflows Gen 2, you can quite seamlessly load the data in, and then in the background, all of the transformations will be moved back, well where possible, to the Fabric warehouse engine. So things will be a lot faster. We've also got a few other minor changes. Templates allow you to import queries. You can design in Excel and load in. And moving on to the next stage, as well as being able to load to multiple destinations, there is another new thing as well, which is the ability to either, when you load data, replace all the data in the place you're loading to, or append to existing data. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people have wanted for a long time. Gen 2 data flows don't do incremental refresh in the way that Gen 1 data flows did. But to be honest, a lot of people got a bit confused with Gen 1 data flows and incremental refresh. And I think Gen 2 data flows are actually a lot simpler and easier to work with as a result. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to get incremental refresh in the future, but there is this other change with Gen 2 data flows. Okay, that's enough of me talking. Let's actually do some demos and see all of this in action and talk about some of these concepts. So let's start with an empty workspace. This is on a trial Fabric capacity, and there is nothing at all here. I want to start building some stuff. Now, the first thing that I need to build is a lakehouse. A lakehouse is the center of the universe in Fabric. It's the place where all of your data gets stored for absolutely everything, including the Power BI, if you want. So I'm going to create a lakehouse. I'm going to call it Devon. Well, let's not call it Devon. Let's call it News, and I'm going to click Create. Why am I going to call it News? Well, I'll explain in a moment. And here we are, an empty lakehouse. It's a place to store data. Now, I want to load some data into Fabric, and I'm going to go and get data, and I'm going to create a new Dataflow Gen 2. I can create a new Dataflow Gen 2 quite nicely here from inside the lakehouse. I've got a few other options for loading data in. But let's create a new Gen 2 Dataflow. And we've got an empty data flow here. And rather than build something from scratch, I'm going to showcase one of the newer features, which is import from a template. And here is a template file that I've created earlier, which has absolutely everything in that I want. And I simply load it in, and bingo, there's my Power Query query already created. What this does is connect to the BBC News RSS feed. So this has gone to the BBC News website, connected to the RSS feed, got a list of all of the latest news stories from it, and turned it into a table. Now, this shows the Power Query interface. There's not that much interesting to see. There's Copilot here, but we're not going to show Copilot today. The interesting thing is down here, this data destination. This is what I was saying. This is the new thing. I can now control where the data gets loaded to. I'm actually going to delete this. If I just loaded it, it would load to the Lakehouse. But what I want to do is show you the process of setting a data destination to talk through it. So I'm going to click the button up here to add a data destination. You can see all of the data destinations that are available. More are coming in the future. I'm going to choose the Lakehouse. I am going to choose the Lakehouse that I just created called News. There aren't any tables in there, so I'm going to load the data into a table called Newsfeed. It says here a new table will be created. Click Next. And then I can say, when I run this data flow, do I want to replace all of the data in the data flow, or do I want to just append the data onto the data that's already there? So I'm just going to click Replace, click Save Settings, and click Publish. There's the data flow that I've created. And now the data flow is going to run, and it's going to connect to the BBC News website and load all of that data into a table inside my Lakehouse. Now, that might take a minute or so, so I'm going to let that run. And I'm going to go back to my presentation and talk about some of the other options. I think for most Power BI users, the only ETL engine that you want is going to be Dataflow's Gen 2. That's the nice, friendly Power Query experience. But Fabric includes experiences for data engineers and data scientists and people who prefer to write code. It offers a fully managed Spark compute platform and notebooks. So you can use Spark, you can write code in notebooks with Python, Scala, R, Spark SQL, all these different things. I'm not going to talk about those because I don't think they're really a selling point for the average Power BI user. But there's always a bit of a kind of grey area between, I can just see Sue saying, you know, Fabric is for Power BI users, because I know it's one of the things. And let me dig myself out of that hole. There is always a grey area. There will always be the people like Sue who, despite being a hardcore Power BI person, is a Python person as well. And there will always be people, and there will always be people who are on that transition, who learn Power BI and then think, well, maybe I want to do Spark, maybe I want to learn Python. And this is where Data Wrangler comes in. Because rather than expecting you to know how to write code, Data Wrangler is a feature inside notebooks, which actually makes it easy for you to write code. It's kind of like a Power Query type thing for writing Python code for data transformations. So let's have a look at this as well. So let me go out of here. My data flow has finished refreshing. That's good. Let's go to my Lakehouse, and there is the table in my Lakehouse that I've created. So like I said, the Lakehouse is like the single place to store all of your data in Fabric, and I've loaded a table into my Lakehouse. It'll load the preview. There we go. And I've got a table of data. Now, let's say that I want to do some more transformation on this, and I'm learning Spark. I can go in and create a new notebook. And it's super easy to start playing around with some of this data. I can just drag and drop data into a cell, and look, there's my data. The Spark session is going to wake up in a moment. It usually wakes up in about 10 seconds. And I'm going to run the cell. It's going to run this SQL query, and it's going to display the data frame. And it's about to return, and bingo, with that, we run a Spark query. But like I said, rather than writing some more code here, what I'm going to do is just do something really simple And instead of displaying the data frame, I'm going to turn it to pandas. Let's run this. Looks like nothing much has happened. But now if I go to data, I've got this option to transform data frame in data wrangler. It will find my data frame. And now I can use a Power Query-like experience to start to do some transformations, and it will generate the code for me. So if I do something really super easy, and let's filter this, and let's filter the description, and let's add a condition and say, let's only get the descriptions that contain UK, and it's generally fairly likely that we'll always get a news story with UK somewhere in the description. I've got my data filtered by the UK. It's generated some code for me. I can add the code back to the notebook. There's the code, and I can run it. And there we are. There's my code.
That's nice.
Didn't need to know any Python at all. And
that's brilliant.
What else can I do here? Well, what else can I do? Maybe I want to do something with this. Maybe I want to save this as a new table. Maybe I want to export all of this to Excel and do something with it. Well, let me grab another little code snippet here. And I can take this data frame and I can save it to my Lakehouse as a CSV file. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the path to the file section of my Lakehouse. I'm going to copy that in there, and I'm going to run this. And it's taken that data frame and it's created a CSV file. And if I refresh this, there's the CSV file. Indeed, if I go back to my Lakehouse and go to the file section here, I can see the CSV file, and bingo, there it is. There's my CSV file. So if you're a Power BI person that wants to learn Python and Spark, you've got this really nice experience to generate the code for you.
That's
what
brilliant.
else have we got? Well, we've also got a kind of version of Azure Data Factory inside Fabric. We've got things called pipelines. Now, again, Azure Data Factory, that's a kind of data engineer tool. Maybe not something you want to get too much into from the Power BI point of view, but it's really easy to use it for one important purpose, which is orchestration. What do I mean by orchestration? Well, I created a data flow to load the data into that table. I then built some Python code in a notebook to say, let's take the data that was loaded in and filter it down to just stories about the UK and save that as a CSV file. I want to run that notebook after the data flow. I don't want them to kind of refresh in parallel because I want to get the new data loaded into the table and then run that notebook. And I can do that with a pipeline. So again, this is something new that I couldn't easily do with things in Power BI before, but now with pipelines, I can do one thing after another. I can control those dependencies all inside here. So let's go back into here. Let's create a new pipeline. Of course. Don't see it when you go, there we go, create a new pipeline. Call it Devon. Click create. And again, what can we do? Well, we can run our data flow, and let's grab data flow 1, which is that data flow that we created earlier to connect to the BBC News site. And like I said, what we want to do next is run our notebook, which is going to be that notebook we just created. And link one to the other, and bingo, instead of refreshing the data flow and the notebook separately, I can use a pipeline to say, let's refresh both of these things, let's do the data flow, and when the data flow succeeds, let's run the notebook. And if I was to run this, it will go away and run the data flow followed by the notebook. And of course, I can have some logic to say if the data flow fails, do something else. I can send messages in Teams. I can send Outlook emails in Outlook, do all kinds of fun stuff. So again, I think a nice incremental improvement, new stuff that I can do that is useful for the Power BI person. All right, so that's enough for data loading. Let's go into a little bit more detail about OneLake and Direct Lake. So OneLake we talked about a bit so far. OneLake, like I said, is the kind of single place to store all of your data in Fabric. It's a place to store tables of data. Now, one of the perhaps I think most exciting thing about OneLake is that it enables a feature in Power BI called Direct Lake. And Direct Lake has the potential to really change how you work with Power BI. Now, what do I mean by this? What I've got here up on the slide is a very traditional Microsoft BI architecture. Now, it talks about data lake architectures, but actually this is the kind of classic enterprise BI architecture that you've used with Power BI in any scenario, regardless of whether you're using a data lake or not. You've got your, am I saying data sets? I mean semantic models. Yes, you know what I mean. So we've got our source data. We're loading our data in to a relational warehouse, maybe Synapse, maybe Snowflake, maybe Databricks SQL warehouses or whatever, or Azure SQL DB, and then you load it into Power BI. Lakehouses change this. How do they change it? Now you load your data into OneLake. OneLake is the place to store all of your tables of data. It's not a relational database. It is based on the Delta format, which is basically a way of storing data in files on a disk. You can actually look inside a lakehouse and you can see the files where the data is stored. So it's an open format for storing data in table form. Now, Delta's been around for a while. Storing data as files on a disk has been around since the year dot. Why is this different? Well, the format that OneLake stores data in enables this new feature called Direct Lake in Power BI. And Direct Lake allows you to use Power BI without using direct query mode, without using import mode, but using the data that's stored directly in the lakehouse. What do I mean by this? Right, let's go into a bit more detail. Up till now, we've had two fundamental storage modes in Power BI. We've had import mode, we've had direct query mode. With import mode, you connect to your data source, you copy the data into your semantic model, and then once that's done, you get to build your reports and query the data, and everything works great. Pro is that it's very fast. The con is you've got to refresh the data, and when the data changes in your data source, you've got to refresh the semantic model, and sometimes that can take quite a long time. Alternatively, you could have used direct query mode, where if you're using a relational database, you can keep your data in the data source, you build your semantic model, and when you run your report, the report queries the semantic model generates SQL queries against the data source. The good thing about this is you don't need to refresh your semantic model. The bad thing is query performance can be a bit slow sometimes. Now, direct lake mode is a new fundamental third storage mode in Power BI. Why is it different? Now, like I said, with OneLake, you're loading your data into OneLake and storing your data in files inside OneLake. The file format, Delta, is based on Parquet. And Parquet files are kind of like a way of storing data in a highly compressed format in files on a disk. Now, the interesting thing is that Parquet as a format is very, very similar to the way that Power BI import mode stores data in memory. And what the clever people on the Power BI development team did is realize that because Parquet file format is so similar to Power BI import mode, memory, the way the data gets stored in memory with import mode, what we can do is store the data in disk in this Delta format, which uses Parquet. You build your semantic model. You don't need to import it. When you build your report, because you've got a semantic model, you build your report, you know the columns, you can drag and drop to build your report. DAX queries gets fired against the semantic model. The semantic model then loads the data on demand from the Delta files inside OneLake. And because the formats are so similar, it can load the data very, very quickly in a matter of seconds. It doesn't load all the data. It only loads the data that's required for the queries you're running, but it basically just imports the data on demand. There is a little bit of an overhead. It might take a couple of seconds sometimes to load the data in, but you're basically getting import mode performance without having to refresh the data. This is pretty cool. Now, this requires Fabric, and Fabric requires a capacity, but this does really kind of change the way that you might work with Power BI and data. It's not quite true to say that no refresh is needed, because you still need to load the data into OneLake. But if you are loading your data into a data warehouse or some other kind of relational database platform before you're loading it into Power BI, then it has the potential to simply kind of knock out that central store and save you an awful lot of time in terms of your refresh and simplify things a lot. So again, let's do a demo. Okay, let's go back to my lakehouse, and remember, here's my table of data. Now, when I build a lakehouse, I automatically get a semantic model built for me. Rather weirdly, I have to go to something called the SQL endpoint to see it, but there is my newsfeed table. Ignore these things, they're going to go away soon. There's my newsfeed data. And guess what? I've got a semantic model already created for me. I can create a new measure on top of it. Let's call it story count. I'm going to say count rows newsfeed. I'm going to build a new report. I haven't queried. All right. Sorry about that. Hopefully this is going to work now, but I haven't changed anything. I haven't imported anything. And I should now be able to just grab the category. And this is the category of story. And I can see, there we are, it's working nicely. I've got 49 stories in the news section and 7 stories in the sport section. So just by loading the data into the lakehouse, I can just start building reports without any import at all. And yes, you've got to load the data into the lakehouse, but as you will find, loading the data into the lakehouse can be a lot faster than doing a refresh in import mode. There's more. There are other benefits to using OneLake as well. The interesting thing about OneLake is that when you've loaded your data in, you can share the data around. You've got a table of data in OneLake. You can then share that table with other people, and they can use that inside their semantic models as well. And you can do this using a feature called shortcuts. So rather than try and talk about this, let me show you another demo about this. Let's not save this report because I'm going to come back and build another report in a minute. But here's my news lakehouse, and I've got a table of news stories, and they've got a publication date. Now, this is Power BI. I don't want to just use the publication date from here. I want a date dimension table. Everybody in my organization wants a date dimension table. But rather than go away and try and build my date dimension table, I know that somebody else in another lakehouse somewhere in my organization has already got a date dimension table in their lakehouse, and I want to use it. So what I can do is get data. I'm going to create a new shortcut, go to one lake. I'm going to go to another lakehouse in another workspace that I have permissions on. Click next. And I'm going to use the date dimension table here and click create. I'm not copying the data into my lakehouse. I'm creating a kind of pointer to that other lakehouse. And now I've got that table appearing, and I can use it inside my semantic model, again, without having to do any refresh whatsoever. So let's go back to the SQL endpoint and go to the model. And let's find where my date table's gone to. There we go. And I can take publication date, drag it onto date here, build a relationship. And now I can start to build my reports. So I can have dimensions that are stored once, loaded once, and then used in however many semantic models I want. If you think about just how many date dimensions there are in all of the semantic models inside your organization and how long you take copying all of that data and refreshing all those tables, that's all gone. You load the data once and it can be reused multiple times. And there's more, because once you've got your data in one lake, you can not only build your reports on top of it, you can query it in SQL, and you can query it in Python or R. Kind of already just showed you how to do that. So all of those data scientists, all of those people who prefer to use SQL queries to analyze that data, they can just do that all over as well. And if I go to here, I could write a SQL query. Run this. Oh, might help if I did that. There we go. And guess what? If I don't like writing SQL, I've got a Power Query experience to generate the SQL for me. So super, super easy to get my data out. All right, there's a lot more to do, and I'm going to try and finish on time as promised. Two more really interesting things to show you that are really relevant. Let's go back to my model and let's build a new report. And let's just build a card with story count on it. So that's the number of stories I've got loaded in. Let's pretend this is any KPI that you want. One area that Power BI has been traditionally weak in has been reporting. Maybe when this story count goes over 60, maybe I want to get alerts. Maybe I want to receive an email. You had got alerts on dashboards in Power BI, but they were very, very basic. Fabric gives you a whole new rich feature for alerting called Data Activator. And you can get at it really, really easily from inside a Power BI report. So with this card here, I can simply, in edit mode, go to set alert. And I would say, well, when this story count goes over 60, I want to create a new alert using Data Activator. I'm going to create a new item here and create the alert. And when this finishes, I promise you, I will be able to there we go. Go into here. And now I can do things and say, hey, send me an email when story count goes over 60. In a moment, it'll take a bit of time to actually show this. If there was some historical data, it would do this. And yeah, I can send an email. I could send a message in Teams. I can also hook this up to Power Automate and get it to run a Power Automate flow when the alert's fired. So this is a whole new feature which allows you to do alerting, which is super cool. One last thing, which is fun. This is for you, Sue.
Is it for me?
Absolutely. So
I'm just blown away, quite honestly.
Right. This is the coolest thing. So we've got our lakehouse, and we've seen already that you can write Python code to get a hold of the data in the lakehouse. But that's the raw data, the tables in the lakehouse. Sometimes your data scientists want to get hold of the data that's actually in your semantic model. And up till now, they've had to kind of export to CSV or Excel and get a hold of the data to play with it in Python. What a new feature called semantic link does is allow you to write Python code in a notebook and connect to your semantic model. Now, this is fun for data scientists, but there's more, I promise you. So let me just show you something fairly basic. So let me just copy some code in here. I'm going to install semantic link and import the SemPy library. This is where all the fun stuff starts. Now, if I was a data scientist, when this runs, I am now going to be able to query semantic model metadata and run DAX queries from a notebook, and indeed run SQL queries against my semantic model as well. All right, so that looks like it has almost done. There we go. And like I said, you can get hold of the metadata. So let's say we want to go to here, and I want to go to my news data set. Sorry, it still uses the old name of data set. And this will list out the tables in there, assuming that I got the name of the workspace right. I think I did, didn't I? Yeah. There we go. So I get hold of the list of tables. If we do some fun stuff here, let's run that. And look, I can run a Spark SQL query to not only show the tables, but this, rather than just showing metadata, I can run a SQL query against my semantic model. Because look, there's that story count measure that I created earlier, and we've come up with a way of turning SQL into DAX. And even if you prefer to write DAX, you can execute a DAX query here. So let's run this, and there's a simple DAX query. There we go. So nice. I want to do this now, but I'm not a data scientist. I don't care about this. What's the really interesting thing? The really interesting thing is this is not just for data scientists. This is for Power BI people, because as well as being able to use semantic link to query in Python, I can also use it to do things like run refreshes and run profiler traces and create semantic link objects like tables and so on. So for example, I can now use this to refresh a single table inside my semantic model rather than the whole thing from a notebook. And remember, I can now run a notebook from inside a pipeline. And that then means that I can do a scheduled refresh inside Fabric for an individual table rather than the whole semantic model. I can run a profiler trace and store the results inside a table in OneLake and use that for analysis. There is tons and tons and tons of stuff you can do with this. If you've ever used Phil Seamark's famous Power BI file for visualizing your Power BI refresh, he's got a new version that he published on his blog, which is not based on a PBX file, but it's based on semantic link and a Python and a Fabric notebook. So now Python becomes almost like VBA for Power BI. All of those admin-y type things that you had to do somewhere outside Power BI, maybe in PowerShell or something, you can just now do inside your workspace. So super cool. I am aware that we are out of time, pretty much. So let me
go to the end. Minutes after.
Well, I want to leave some time for questions. That's pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about. Hopefully I've convinced you that there is a lot of cool stuff in Fabric that is useful for the hardcore Power BI person who is not a data engineer, not a BI professional, not somebody who builds, data warehouses or anything like that. There's a lot of stuff for you and, your colleagues as well. And of course, there is loads of cool stuff for your colleagues who are data scientists, data engineers, BI professionals, and everything. It's a complete package. So what's the call to action? Go away, set up your Fabric trial capacity now, start playing with all of these things, and start having fun with Fabric and making your Power BI life easier as a result.
Wow, I'm quite blown away. Actually, there's a lot. I think I'm gonna have to re-watch this to let it all sink in. It's just come on leaps and bounds, hasn't it, from when it was first introduced? I'm going to go through the questions, Chris, because we've got quite a few, and I'm going to start from the top rather than going down. So starting from the data flows. So Jonathan Scott's asked. Data flows Gen 2 user experience is still pretty bad in his experience. Is it still in preview? He keeps having to refresh the browser to get them to publish. And when are the improvements scheduled for?
Improvements are made all the time. Yes, I mean, I think Dataflow Gen 2 still has a little bit of work to do, especially in terms of performance and things. But there's one particular improvement that's coming soon, which will make a big difference to the performance of them. That's coming in a month or two. I can't really say anything else, but yeah, we are aware of the issues with Dataflow's Gen 2 at the moment, and they are going to get better. Trust me.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Oliver O'Shea said, can Spark processes get around dynamic API refresh issues in the service? I think you've...
Depending on what you mean, yes, because rather than using a data flow and M code to connect to a web service, if you can write the Python code, then yes, you can run that from a notebook. And if I'm honest, it's probably going to be easier to write the Python code to connect to a web service and get the data into OneLake than it is to write the M code. Because, Power Query is very easy until you connect to a web service. And that's when it starts getting very hard. And a lot of things are frankly only possible with custom connectors, which then force you to use a gateway, which are massively complicated. So if you're connecting to a complex API, you probably do want to use Python to connect.
APIs can sometimes be really tricky, can't they?
Yes.
Anthony said, assume you can change the generated Python code.
With Data Wrangler, yes, you can.
Okay. Henrique asked, can pipelines run Power BI data sets or semantic
models? Good question. Spoiler, I'm not really sure whether I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it. We have it on the roadmap for the future to have a pipeline activity for refreshing a Power BI data set. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Semantic model. Semantic
model. Kimberly's asked, can you schedule re-pipelines using a custom calendar, i.e. a fiscal calendar that the user defines?
No, I'm not a pipelines expert. You've got a lot more flexibility with scheduling with pipelines, but no, I don't think so at the moment, but there are things coming that might let you do that. I'm going to say maybe in the future.
Okay, hang on, we've got some more. Started chatting amongst themselves. Is the date table physically still in the other lake house and we just visualize it here, but it resides elsewhere?
Exactly. Yes, that's the whole point about shortcuts. Yes, you can have one table, you load it in once, there's one copy of it. You can have as many shortcuts as you want and as many semantic models sharing that table, and there is still only one copy of the data. So using shortcuts for things like shared dimension tables is going to save you a massive amount of refresh time and CPU.
And Jack's asked, do you need to mark the date table as a date table or will it know it? I presume you mark it the first time?
Still no. So this is an interesting thing. When you create a shortcut, it's still just a table of data. It's not a semantic model table. So you still need to mark it as a date table and add all that extra stuff. But I know what you mean and I know what you're getting at. And maybe one day we will get there for you to be able to kind of share not only the table of data, but also properties like, the fact it's a date table.
Fernando's asked, when is the trial going to start counting down from Fabric?
Very soon, very soon.
And then someone else said, Christian said, don't remind him. Let's hope everyone forgets. And question for later, Henrik said, when does the data activator run? Can it be set to run when a data set refresh finishes?
No, data activator kind of just polls in the background. So you can control how often it will check the data.
So Salih says, so all of us Power BI advanced users become data scientists by using OneLake. This is
exactly.
awesome.
And I think, like I said, the boundaries are blurred. You can't just put yourself into one bucket. We're all Power BI people, but we're all other things as well. And like you, Sue, you're a Power BI person and you're a Python person. So
yeah,
don't limit yourself.
No, and Python's quite nice to learn, and especially with all ChatGPT, and as you've just shown, there's a lot of help and advice. I learned R because I wanted to learn a particular library that it had. So we've got so much help. You can just pop in and with a little bit of understanding. So Biniam asked, is Synapse going away, replaced by Fabric?
The diplomatic answer is that Synapse is not going away. It's not deprecated. It's still going to be supported, but Fabric is the strategic direction. Fabric is where all of our development effort is going. If you want to learn something new and invest in the future, Fabric is the future.
Okay, yeah, because Biniam was asking about I'm not sure if it's was thinking about getting a couple of Synapse certifications, but possibly focus on Fabric rather than Synapse.
Get the Fabric certifications.
Yeah, and someone else has asked, has anyone done the certification? But no one on the call has done so yet. So I think that's going to be one of the drivers to go forward. I think I've got everyone's questions. Have I got any further questions? And Fernando's put in a link to getting the Fabric analytics. He said bingo. Not going away, but not developed more. So any further questions for Chris? Oh, look at you, Chris. 7 o'clock.
Yoga time.
Yoga time. Woohoo! That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Because I saw your presentation at Data Relay on this, and that was maybe 4 months ago. And
Yes.
it's just evolved immensely from 4 months ago. So it's mind-blowing, isn't it, what you can do? But what I think is also really helpful is the way that there's help for you. So, for example, with a Python, with trying to make things as easy as possible. So, yeah, getting lots and lots of claps. So, thank you very much. And for everybody else, I will record this because I know I'll have to go back and rewatch it. Copilot came to Fabric today, so Henrique's just activated it. Oh, that would be good. Henrique and I have a study plan once a week, so he can show me what he's learned. And thank you, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll reload it, and thank you everyone for all of your questions and for joining in, and we will see you next week. Next week we have Paul talking about geospatial analysis. So have a look at the meetup group because there are some really good sessions coming up. So we've got Paul, we've also got Laura GB, Power Automate, and Power Apps, and Tabular Editor. We're having a really deep, in-depth dive from Daniel, who is the author of Tabular Editor. So there's some really interesting things coming up. So thank you, Chris. I will let you get on with the rest of your day, and thank you everybody else, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.